Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Happy Friday, everybody. Good morning here in DC. Good evening on the other side of the Pacific. Thank you for joining us. We've made it. This is the fourth and final monthly session of the 11th annual CSIS South China Sea Conference. And I sincerely hope it's the last time that you have to see me host it from this home office. So I look forward to hosting everybody next year in person, God willing, in DC. But we're going out with a bang today. So far this year, we've covered political developments, military developments, legal developments, and today we're going to pull back a little and look at geopolitics, the role of external parties in the South China Sea, the interests and role of external parties in the South China Sea. And we have a really fantastic lineup to do that. Before I introduce them, let me do the normal housekeeping. I'm Greg Poland. I run the Southeast Asia program and the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative here at CSIS. Everything you hear today is going to be on the record. We'll be live streaming it on YouTube, on CSIS.org. We'll have it posted on YouTube and CSIS in a day or so. We'll be live tweeting, so however you like to take in your insights, we'll have it for you. And today's event is made possible by generous support from the Foundation for East Sea Studies at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam and the embassies of New Zealand, Australia, and Japan here in Washington, as well as general support to CSIS. Once we finish with our keynotes, we're going to do our normal Q&A. And because we're on Zoom, we'll use the Q&A function. So you can go ahead and type in your questions. If you could identify yourself, your institution, that's always appreciated. And I will read those questions to our speakers. I think that's it for me. So why don't I go ahead and introduce our first keynoter. So first, we're going to hear from Dr. Pooja Bhatt, who is an independent researcher focused on maritime security. Most recently, Pooja was an assistant professor at the School of Military Affairs, Strategy and Logistics at Rashtriya Raksha University in Gandhinagar, Gujarat. And Pooja, please kick us off.
Good morning, everyone sitting on the other side of Atlantic, and good evening, everyone on this side of Pacific. As Greg introduced you, I'm Pooja Bhatt, and thank you, Greg and CSIS, for having me for this talk. I'm glad and honored to be presenting my views on India's interest in the South China Sea. So before I start, I would start by reiterating that India's interest in maritime domain in general, and South China Seas in particular, is neither new nor unique. So there is a multidimensionality in India's maritime interest. And before I take it further, I would just want to go through those factors just to establish those facts. So first of those factors would be historical, of course. So there has been an established proof that since 4th and 5th century BC, ancient Indian kingdoms have been contacting its far off neighbors and civilization through trade, and maritime domain was a crucial part of it. And in the recent times, Indian Navy is doing that same role, conducting, in addition to the protecting trade routes, they're conducting port visits to several countries in South and Southeast Asia. And it has been going since 1960s as a part of its global outreach. The second important factor is the diplomatic relations that India maintains with its South and Southeast Asian neighbors. So coming to current times and taking the facts and statements into consideration from the Indian policy establishment, as a part of India's Act East policy and neighborhood first policy, which is all about its domestic policy connecting to its neighborhood through trade, cultural, historical, and other various means. So in that aspect, India's SAGAR, which is security and growth for all in Indian Ocean region, as well as Indo-Pacific, India's free and open Indo-Pacific region policy, is an extension of its foreign policy approach. Therefore, it is a part of reinvigorating its historical, cultural, and trade relationship with the East Asian countries. India also have comprehensive and strategic partnerships with several Southeast Asian countries, including ASEAN nations, Vietnam, South Korea, Australia, as well as New Zealand. Third aspect of India's interest in South China Sea and maritime domain is the energy security. India being a developing country, energy security remains one of the top concerns for the country. As per 2017 data, which is yet to be updated by the Indian government, India's 55% of the trade passes through the South China Sea. In addition to the oil and gas transport, we also have a joint Indian Oil Videsh Limited, which is the foreign hand of state-owned Indian oil company. In joint collaboration with Petro Vietnam, they have been conducting oil exploration in 2 of the blocks in South China Sea, very close to the so-called 9-9 in the blocks 127 and 128. So this was a third aspect why India is interested in terms of its energy security in the South China Sea. Fourth remains India's approach to multilateralism. This angle of Indian maritime approach has been belief in maritime multilateral institution, which is based upon common and mutually agreed norms, values, approach, as well as rules-based order. The same sentiments have been repeatedly echoed by several senior officials, including Prime Minister Modi, at various regional and international fora in the past few years. And we have been constantly listening about free and open Indo-Pacific and inclusive Indo-Pacific region, India's vision for Sagar and its connectivity to its Southeast Asian and East Asian neighbors. In addition to that, India is seeking its increasing participation in several multilateral institutions for larger peace, security, and development of the Indian Ocean. So in all this, South China Sea plays a crucial point of connection, and India's presence, both physically and politically, as well as militarily in the South China Sea, should be seen from this context, I believe. Across administration, several defense minister, external affairs minister from India have constantly gone on record to say South China Sea is a common property of the world. That was a term they used in few years back, something which has been upgraded to be called as global commons last year by the Indian official statement. So it is so South China Sea's approach has to be seen from that context as well. Last remaining context to the military context. So from Indian Navy's point of view, the primary area of interest remains Indian Ocean, of course, and that primary area of responsibility is extending from the African coast to Strait of Malacca towards the east. And what is beyond it is, of course, the secondary area of interest. However, they connect India's crucial trade and other supplies to the Indian Ocean, and it remains crucial for Indian military to remain visible in that region as well. So the security and safety of the sea line of communications, safeguarding of Indian maritime and territorial interests in the region, as well as addressing of traditional and non-traditional threats in collaboration with like-minded countries in the region remains the military objective of India. So keeping these facts in picture, now what has changed in Indian foreign policy approach towards in maritime domain, I believe, has been its approach, which has become more vocal in foreign policy objectives. Its maritime claims, it has become more vocal in all those regards. And in this regard, I would see the year 2011 as a crucial turning point when India faced difficult diplomatic interactions with China in the South China Sea. So in June 2011, Indian naval ship Eleventh, which was making a port visit in Vietnam, was asked by PLA Navy to identify itself and explain its presence. Again in 2011 November, there were the joint exploration conducted by India and Vietnam in the South China Sea. It was given a démarche by Beijing, calling it an illegal exploration in South China Sea waters. So what India suddenly saw, and I think that was a sudden realization that not only its maritime interests are being challenged, but its economic interest, its and as well as its foreign policy objectives are being challenged by single country repeatedly. And also the same thing has been seen in the multilateral and the scene of multilateralism, where China has become very, very aggressive, if I may say. So I think keeping all these up, India's own interest into the South China Sea in mind, and how a single country has been, challenging all these Indian interests in the South China Sea has been a very crucial reason why India has become very vocal in the South China Sea. And whatever activities, that behavior, and the foreign policy statements and that we've been seeing in the current times are a manifestation of those. I think with this, I would want to round up my talk, and if I have any questions from the audience, I would be happy to take it. Thank you.
Thank you, Pooja. Let's turn second to Hung Lei Tu. Hung is a non-resident adjunct fellow with the Southeast Asia program at CSIS, which is, of course, what matters most to me. But more importantly, she's a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and a member of the advisory Griffith Asia Institute at Griffith University in Australia. Hung, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Greg. Good to be with you, and thank you for having me. Good evening from Australia. It's almost it's past midnight, so I'm not sure to say good evening or good morning, but I use this time to give you a sketch of the very fast evolving strategic context in Australia, and I'd like to share with you some of my analysis, and I have to emphasize that those are my opinions only, and I don't represent any country or institution. And because it's so late at night, I hope you forgive me if I fall asleep. I hope I don't sleepwalk into any war or conflict by doing so. I think Australia's position in South China Sea is relatively well known. There have been some developments, which I will get to that in a moment, but I wanted to really show you how important the recent development have been in really shaping Australia's strategic personality, in fact, because Australia used to be known as a middle power that always support international law and being very active in diplomacy. But in recent months, 18 months or so, even more, Australia is increasingly more of a strategic heavyweight in the region, and I'll walk you through why. So still, of course, Australia maintains that middle power identity. It's also very dedicated to a rules-based global system. It defends the rules-based order. Of course, the liberal democracy. It's very much a damming up against any forms of coercion in the region. But it's not just how it expresses its foreign policy or so-called declaratory defense of the global rules-based order. Australia has recently showed in more concrete terms that it is willing to really heavyweight in that regard to protect that stability and address rising tensions in the region as well. One of the most recent examples, maybe perhaps, is the very famous, or already maybe in some circles infamous announcement of AUKUS that involves also the US and the UK, which we'll get into that in a moment. But throughout the recent development from, for example, the Defense White Paper a few years back, but last year in the middle of the pandemic, there was Australia's strategic update and defense posture in which Australia more willingly addressed the changing strategic environment that is deteriorating with more tension, and also possibility for escalation. But to this, Australia has said to be prepared to deter any actions and to respond to any potential military force if required. And Australia wants to shape the strategic environment in the broader Indo-Pacific. That's why it's been quite active in promoting the Indo-Pacific strategy too. So that those are the recent, quite significant development that changes Australia's role as well as positioning other relevant geopolitical hotspot, including the South China Sea in it. But why those changes, right? The changes, of course, I think we can identify and pinpoint back to China. I think by now it's pretty clear that Canberra has made up its mind about that China poses threat to the regional stability, and there's no question about that anymore. I think that the deteriorating bilateral relations with China is de facto a new normal, and then at the moment the bilateral relationship is pretty much completely frozen in a limbo to a degree where no dialogue whatsoever are on the meaningful official channels. And so Australia's attitude towards speaking up on relevant issues has been also conditioned by that. For example, Australia's attitude towards Taiwan has changed increasingly closer to these days, with bolder engagement and without particular fear of angering China anymore, because China is already angry, right? Just as we speak, the former Prime Minister Tony Abbott is in Taiwan delivering keynote speech at the Yushan Forum and meeting with President Tsai Ing-wen, which he does in his private capacity, but he also openly admits that he does not hesitate anymore to visit Taiwan, which he would have 2 years ago for considering Beijing's reaction. But right now, the relationship between Australia and China are in such a point that I don't think that consideration is particularly sensitive anymore. Australia also has taken very strong position in a number of issues that were particularly sensitive to China. From speaking up on Xinjiang Uyghur human rights violation, on Hong Kong, of course, Taiwan I mentioned, the inquiry to the origins of COVID, which also is particularly sensitive to China. Of course, Australia has been also quite openly criticizing the Belt and Road Initiative as a death trap diplomacy, South China Sea being another case, and even recently objecting to China's potential participation in this or joining the CPTPP. So it really spans across domains, from human rights domestically to complicated borders to global governance or even trade. And in terms of external security, I think China has increasingly, not only within their policy establishment, but also among people, has been becoming more clear of a threat, and more Australian public considers China a threat than a few years back, to the degree that quite recently, also within the past few months, we had a high level senior official from Australia's government talking about drums of war and warning about potential conflict, military tension in the Asia-Pacific region. And we also have Chief of Defense Forces saying at the speech at ASPI, actually, when he quoted that you might not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And in all those scenarios, in all those speeches, that implied a potential Taiwan contingency. So the thoughts of really rapidly deteriorating strategic situation and China's role in it, as well as potential regional conflict, is more and more real to the Australian defense and policy establishment these days. And what about South China Sea? Well, actually, the on the South China Sea front, South China Sea has become more of a regular case example whenever coercion is mentioned, or whenever challenge to the global or regional order is challenged, or rules-based order. But beyond that, I think at the moment, I think the Taiwan contingency is preoccupying more of the public and policy attention, imagination, I would say. But there have been several important developments that I would like to mention. First of all, the Australian government has in last year come out with, along with a wave of non-UN verbals in the UN, openly rejecting China's territorial and maritime claims in the South China Sea, aligning itself more closely with those that came out too, including the claimant states in Southeast Asia. So really, Australia has abandoned that neutrality and has explicitly said that China has no legal basis. That is consistent really with Australia's so far attitude, which is always supporting the rules-based order and become very forward-leaning when, for example, 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling came out. So that's not particularly surprising, but I think there are certain still challenges to Australia's position in South China Sea. Is that on one hand, Australia supports international law and rules-based approach, which imply that it would support a code of conduct as a means of dispute management, and because Australia also support ASEAN centrality, that could imply that Australia should and would also support a code of conduct. But the reality is Australia is not going to be very happy if a non-substantial, a weak or pro forma code of conduct comes out of this still lengthy negotiations. So this is one of the potential challenges ahead of Australia and Australia's policy towards South China Sea. Another one is, there are also considerations. What if the Biden administration will pressure Australia more to join, for example, FOMO's operations, given that Australia's readiness to show its willingness to shoulder some of the defense responsibilities in the region. I think there are still hesitations on both sides of arguments. So, but that's potentially something that also can come back, and it's likely to come back in the discussion in the coming months going ahead. Now, I don't want to take too much time, but I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions about AUKUS, the new and exciting thing, which is the trilateral arrangements between Australia, the UK, and US, as well as a nuclear powered submarine deal, and what would that mean for the regional security issues as well as maritime security. I might leave it to the Q&A sessions to elaborate on that, but I don't want to take up more time of the fellow speakers, so I'll stop here now for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Eun. I'm sure nobody in the audience has even heard of this AUKUS thing you're talking about. Before we get to Q&A, though, why don't I turn it over to Tetsuo Katani. Tetsuo is a professor of global studies at Meikai University and a senior fellow with Japan Institute for International Affairs. He was also once a visiting scholar with the Japan chair at CSIS, and so, like Eun, is a member of the tribe, whether he likes it or not. Tetsuo?
Well, thanks, Greg. It's great to be back at this conference. My last participation was 5 years ago, the day the arbitral tribunal issued the merit. So 5 years have passed, and so today let me say one thing, which is, some people recently said we have lost the South China Sea, but I disagree. Actually, I think we are pushing back over the past 1 year. That's my basic argument today. So, for example, on the 5th anniversary of this year, several countries issued mentioning the Chinese claims in the South China Sea are actually unlawful, which is a very strong statement, which we never seen back in 5 years ago. But more and more countries are now taking a tougher stance on Chinese unilateral claims in the South China Sea. So that's point number one. And also in the United Nations, over the past years, we have seen a series of note verbals issued by relevant countries, countries like Japan, US, Australia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, plus extra regional countries, including UK, France, and Germany. And they basically stated that the China's claims in the South China Sea does not fit into the UNCLOS. For example, the China's claim of the excessive baseline in the parcels and possibly in spratteries. And also they are stating that according to the arbitral tribunal's merit, there's no islands in the South China Sea, so China cannot claim any of the land features as island. So there are very strong statements from the relevant countries, and this is actually something new. And plus, not only those diplomatic engagements, those countries actually showed their resolve by sending naval ships and aircraft to the South China Sea. For example, the French dispatched the nuclear submarine to the South China Sea this year, and the UK is, of course, now deploying its carrier strike group with US forces and Dutch. And Germany is now sending its frigate to this region. So those countries are actually endorsing their diplomatic statement by force. And this is actually, again, something new. So I can say over the past 5 years, China was almost finishing its militarization of the artificial islands in the South China Sea, and this is why some people said we are losing in the South China Sea. But actually, there are movements to push back over the past 1 year. And perhaps the credit might go to the Trump administration. Trump administration last year made a strong statement on the South China Sea, and the other countries actually followed the Trump administration's way. For Japan, the South China Sea is a critical shipping lane, and although we are not the claimant state, but we have deep interest in the freedom of navigation and overflight across the South China Sea. And since 2017, we are dispatching our naval task force to the South China Sea and also in the Indian Ocean. And at this current moment, we have one helicopter carrier, Kaga, in the South China Sea, operating together with other like-minded nations. And this helicopter carrier, Kaga, is a Hyuga class destroyer, which is now converting into a light aircraft carrier. So perhaps next year, we're going to have a light Japanese carrier in the South China Sea. Although the F-35B might not on board yet, but in several years, it's possible for Japan to deploy a carrier with F-35B on board in the South China Sea. And earlier this year, we provided air defense radar to the Philippines so that they can enhance their maritime domain awareness. And recently, Defense Minister Kishi visited Hanoi, and they agreed on the transfer of defense equipment. So in coming years, I can expect that Japan would provide naval vessels to Vietnam. So military capacity building is ongoing. And we just had a new prime minister and he made a policy statement today. And to our surprise, not only he indicated that his administration would revise our 2013 national security strategy, but also his administration would pledge to double our defense spending. If this is realized, that will make a huge difference, not only for the defense of Japan, but also the regional security, including the South China Sea. So although there have been a change of governments in Tokyo, I could expect our continued engagement and also the strengthened commitment to the peace and stability and the rules-based order in the South China Sea by Tokyo for the coming years. That's all I have.
Thank you, Tetsuo. And batting last for us, but certainly not least, is going to be Dr. Alessio Patalano, who's a senior lecturer in war studies at King's College London. He's also director of the Asian Security and Warfare Research Group at King's China Institute. Alessio?
Greg, thank you very much for the opportunity to join this distinguished panel today. And I've just realized that I am the last speaker of the last session on a Friday, which puts me in a rather difficult position. So I'll try not to upset too much people by adding on top of what's been said so far, with which I agree wholeheartedly. The question that was posed to me was really to try to bring this matter of the South China Sea within the context of recent activities and changes taking place in Europe in a broader sense. And in fact, it is true that if we place the South China Sea as a crucial piece in the broader Indo-Pacific puzzle, the last year and a half has been an absolutely incredibly important year for European actors, as well as the European Union itself and NATO, so nationally and multilaterally, to start engaging with the question, what is the Indo-Pacific to this part of the world? So today I have really 3 points that I want to sort of start sharing with you to kickstart the conversation at the European end. One is about what I call the Europe-Indo-Pacific nexus, the frameworks. And even though Tetsuo is absolutely correct that the French are there because they're there all the time for reasons that I'll explain in a second, the Brits have been there, even the Germans, the Dutch, we're all coming that part of the world. The frameworks that are guiding the reasoning behind these deployments and these engagement activities are quite different. And in this respect, I would say that the UK and France define the extreme of this spectrum within which you'll find different positions. What do I mean by this? France is a very unique Indo-Pacific actor in the European context because it's an Indo-Pacific resident power. Because of the overseas territories, because of 1.6 million residents in the region, because of the particular dynamics between the overseas territory and the metropole, and above all, the non-negligible factor that more than 70% of the French EEZ, which makes France the country with the largest exclusive economic zone in the world, are actually placed in that part of the world. French interests in the Indo-Pacific are territorial, national, sovereign, on top of being related to broader issues such as maritime order and structural stability in international relations. At the opposite end of that spectrum, perhaps the UK is a good example of the other sort of set of reasons behind the European engagement with the region. Because for the UK, as the recent integrated review highlighted, the Indo-Pacific is understood to be one, the place of the key geopolitical challenges of the next 10, 15 years. So that structural element of the story, but also an important space for opportunities in terms of building the future of global prosperity. And as a corollary to that, and a very important element attached to it, is this idea that the Indo-Pacific is also a place where the present and future international order are being reshaped. And the maritime domain stands at the very heart of this story. What happens in the maritime domain, if you don't respond or push back in terms of infractions and erosions of the fundamental principles of the international order, then will be extended and present some sort of a precedent intellectually, if not practically, for other spaces such as cyber and space. So in terms of frameworks, I would say the UK and France give us a very good sort of canvas of flavors that you'll find in Europe, with Germany certainly standing with the European Union somewhere in the middle. Now, what are the differences and what sort of determines where you are on that spectrum? There's two things really. One is available means to meet particular security interests. And in this respect, again, France and the UK stand at the top end of the spectrum as opposed to your average European country, because European security takes priority when it comes to assigning resources to deal with international affairs. And the second aspect that is not negligible is the perception of China. When we talk about Europe, we should not make the mistake to sort of put us all together. And I'm not saying this because I'm sitting in London, which apparently has been ousted out of Europe altogether. And the reason it's real, there is a very different and conflicted perception of what kind of security actor China is, what kind of challenge it presents, and there is no agreement about how to deal with it. And this leads to the second point, or the second nexus that I want to talk about, and that is that sort of prosperity security nexus. How in Europe the China puzzle is understood then reflects and affects how the relationship between prosperity-related sort of interests connected to where security should be placed in order to address them. And in this respect, again, the UK, because of the understanding of the geopolitical challenges that starts in Indo-Pacific and affects the rest of the world, is perhaps the country in Europe with the more acute understanding of the multidimensional security challenge that the region is facing, and how China is at the center of this. In the UK Integrated Review, the principal understanding is that in today's world, in which state-on-state competition is back on the menu as the primary tool that defines the structural nature of international relations, there is no prosperity without security. And security is underwritten also by hard capabilities. Now, that understanding is not shared across Europe. And perhaps here the best example of this is both Germany and its guidelines for Indo-Pacific approach, as well as the European Union Indo-Pacific strategy, which, as was mentioned earlier on, was overshadowed by AUKUS, not least because AUKUS spoke to this hardcore element that without capabilities and security, you don't have stability and therefore prosperity, casting a larger shadow over a lot of the negotiating position in Europe over the importance of the Indo-Pacific and specifically hotspots like the South China Sea. However, this means that within this context of the prosperity security nexus, what we're likely to see, and this is one place where all European countries, the main actors anyway, seem to agree, engagement with ASEAN, both politically and economically, remains a central factor, particularly when it comes to the South China Sea. And when we talk about the UK in particular, there is a recognition of multilateral economic forums as another important place where matters of principles and values. How do we maintain open societies and open economies that underwrite prosperity and that also push actors revisionist in nature like China or Russia in a corner, automatically set them at the naughty table? And that context, you see the UK's application to CTPP, as well as engagement with the importance of multilateral forums like ASEAN. And this leads to the sort of third sort of element of the story, which is what I call the military constabulary nexus. And this is very important, particularly in the South China Sea, because a lot of what happens in terms of sources of instability in the South China Sea pertain to two parallel and sometimes overlapping, but still not exactly the same type of issues. One is what I call the military coercive side of the spectrum. And here the artificial islands in the South China Sea are the best example. Built on the back of a bogus maritime claim that's been debunked in 2016, they are fundamentally platforms for the projection of military power further into the South China Sea. So whilst they are based on bogus claims, their main sort of potential source of instability stands to the operational balance of the region rather than the maritime order per se. Whereas then one has the more sort of constabulary nature of some of the claims, some more the specific claims, in which the activities conducted by coast guards, militias are at the forefront of that battle over how one understands the manifestation of sovereignty at sea, disputed as it is. And this sort of nexus is important because it also tells us something about how European actors are approaching what they think could be their role in the stability of the South China Sea and broadly speaking on the Indo-Pacific. And here I would like to talk about the sort of element of the story about capacity building, both in terms of capabilities as well as know-how and best practices. The point that Tetsuyo was making about Japan is absolutely true for most European countries. I would expect countries with that wider canvas of understanding of the security challenges in the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific, like France and UK, to certainly cover that. And perhaps those with a sort of like a narrower understanding of what the security challenges are, or certainly willingness and capacity to engage with, to focus particularly on capacity building, because it puts an emphasis on cooperation rather than competition or pushback. But the opposite is like how to work with the capabilities and contribution that you have to complement and integrate what major actors in the region can and are doing. And here the case of France and the UK stand out as the most important. Now, let me just sort of point out that before we rush off to other things, that the UK still is the only European country and the only country outside the United States who have conducted a maritime challenge of excessive claims in the South China Sea around the Strait baselines applies to the parcels in 2018. And it's also the only country, together with France, to have regularly conducted sailing activities that challenge some of the more sort of problematic claims that set forth by different actors in the region. And as we move forward, I think the key difference here is that because France's main interests are predominantly and foremost based on its presence as an Indo-Pacific state actor with an important EEZ there, I think we will continue to see a slight difference between France and Germany and the UK in terms of how the freedom of navigation is exercised. With France focusing particularly on EEZ and sort of like inappropriate uses of principles applied to EEZ, and UK perhaps focuses also on things that speak more to that geopolitical competition. Where does this all leave us? And this is where my conclusions come along. The Europeans are waking up to the importance of the Indo-Pacific, and AUKUS perhaps has thrown a span in the works sort of temporarily. The long-term impact of that, I think it's a conversation that we should start having because there could be a longer-term impact, although I'm not necessarily sort of convinced of that. However, even though we're showing up, we're doing stuff, it doesn't mean that we've figured everything out, and above all, that we are ready and capable of understanding how to react to crises that might flare up at any given point in time. And here I'm thinking, when talking about South China Sea, something that we haven't really discussed so far today, and that is the sort of the odd scenario. There's something like Pratas Islands that might be at the receiving end of extreme coercive action that lead to a change of hands, and which inevitably would raise very important questions, particularly from a European perspective, to those countries that have been there. What do you do with it? What everything you have done speaks to a crisis like that? At the moment, we don't simply have an answer to that. We are just at the beginning of the conversation, which is why I'm really sort of pleased with the opportunity to be here and share this conversation with you, because that what we talk about next, how we approach this next, is perhaps the most important part of the journey. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Alessio. Those were some great opening remarks. We have about 45 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to abuse the role of the moderator here because I want to follow up with Alessio and Pooja on a specific topic. So Tetsuo mentioned that last time he was here 5 years ago was the day that we hosted the conference on July 12th, 2016, the date of the arbitral award. That was also the last time that Europe kind of had one voice on the South China Sea, right? So in March 2016, You had the European Union issue the joint statement saying that they would call on China to comply with the ruling, call on both parties to comply with the ruling. And then Europe went silent. And 2 years later, the UK finally called on China to comply with the ruling a few months before the Albion went out and did the FONOP that Alessio mentioned. Just 2 months ago, I think, we finally had the German defense minister call on China to comply with the ruling. So my question to you, Alessio, is one, what's taking France so long? And two, is that kind of unity in Europe possible again? Will we ever hear the European Union call for compliance or speak with one voice on the South China Sea again?
I don't think you're going to see anything like that within the next 18 months, unless it is such a preposterous action that will unify everything and everybody. Because the German elections have created a situation, a sort of stalemate, in which that sort of Paris-Berlin axis that really is the propelling engine behind the European Union as a whole, it's now stalled. And until the situation in Germany sort of comes back with the decisive government, which might not very well be the case, you won't see that sort of process being driven within the EU. Having said so, already the first, I mean, you're absolutely right. In March, there was a statement, but then when the award came out, the European Union response was notable only because of its weakness in the aftermath of the award. So in a way, that divide and conquer that is very much of what the Chinese foreign policy in Europe used to be, at the time was very effective. That is no longer that much of a problem in Europe, whereby even in Brussels, there is a certain understanding of Chinese behavior in diplomacy that isn't particularly sort of pleasing or acceptable. So in that sense, the Chinese element of that equation is less important when we're thinking about fragmentation, as it used to be the case 5 years ago. However, the flip side of that coin, Europe coming together with a cohesive voice, hasn't really quite happened yet. And the strongest you can expect, it's something more from a place like NATO rather than the European Union.
Thank you. Pooja, I want to ask a similar question. Ever since 2016, Indian officials have tiptoed right up to the line of endorsing the arbitral award, say things like, oh, you know, we abide by our arbitrations when it comes to Bangladesh. Shouldn't that be what all great powers do? And you know, disputes should be resolved according to UNCLOS. But we've never had Delhi actually say that China should comply with the arbitral award. What are the chances that it ever gets there?
I think that's a very interesting question. And yes, you are right in a way that Indian administration has never openly accepted to say that China should be abiding. But I think there have been several statements since then where, you know, India said that India upholds the rule of law and other countries in the region should also do so for the peace and larger prosperity of the region. I think it was a very indirect way of conveying the same message, given the very complicated India-China relationship, both on the territorial and the maritime borders that we see, and as well as we have you know, very, very difficult economic connections with China. I think the kind of interconnection the two countries are, Indian government has been a bit shy in overtly stating it's like it has actually made a very clear statement on how South China Sea should be a part of global commons, and you know, all the countries in the region should you know, follow rule of law and you know, things like that. However, it has never said, I don't think even I have come across a statement where Indian government official has ever said that China should follow, you know, the PCA arbitral award. I think in the given time, if the situations remain the same and India keep facing such difficult choices to make in the international fora, we might see some kind of statement coming out in the future. However, given the situations right now, I think India would still continue to shy away in making that such kind of, you know, statement is what I see.
Thanks, Pooja. Okay, let's go to the audience queue. And again, if you have questions for any individual member of the panelists or just the panel in general, go ahead and type it in, but please identify yourself and your home institution if you would. So the first question I have is for Tetsuo. To Mr. Tetsuo Kutani from Commodore Razak. Do you think regional groupings like AUKUS and the Quad can force China into a more conciliatory posture on the South China Sea?
Unfortunately, no. we have seen no change in Chinese attitudes. So what we are doing is, first of all, try to balance what China is doing, not only in the South China Sea, but also in the Western Pacific. We have to show our determination to preserve the peace and security, and also the rules-based international order in this region. So it's very difficult to actually change the Chinese behavior, but at least we have to continue to signal to Beijing that we will never accept the China's hegemonic behavior. And Beijing doesn't care any particular nation's unilateral response, but Beijing does care the collective response by multiple players. So Quad is primary framework for us to signal Beijing, and AUKUS is another framework, and we have to combine those different multilateral or trilateral frameworks to continue to signal Beijing that we will never accept their unilateral claims. But at the same time, we have to accept the reality that it's not so much easy to change actual Chinese behavior.
Thank you, Tetsuo. Does anybody else have thoughts on the role of the Quad or AUKUS here, beyond what we've already heard in the presentation? Alessio?
Great.
Oh,
great.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, can I jump in? I think, yeah, I agree with Tatsuo saying that they serve the purpose of signaling, the purpose of responding to Chinese hyperactivities, I would say, in the South China Sea, but also beyond. And I think there's a challenge because it's those are mini-lateral, plurilateral, multilateral, and there will always be a lag in catching up because coordination takes time, whereas China is in a more active position. It's unilateral, therefore will be always more faster in that regard. But I think, yeah, it is certainly a purpose of signaling that and makes China think twice, whatever it wants to do or intends to do, that increasingly, and also it's also there is a function of increase in response, right? Additionally, in the beginning, Quad was very informal, very relatively shy, but increasingly not so much. I mean, it's elevated to the leaders summit level. Now we have another arrangements, the AUKUS, but which is precisely actually more defense and security focused rather than as diplomatic as Quad, because Quad's agenda is more actually on foreign policy heavy rather than defense heavy. But I think there is a signaling there that there is only not on one mechanism, there are multiple mechanisms, and with multiple actors, some of them overlap, but I don't think we will stop at AUKUS as well. I think there will be a proliferation of different initiatives there. So as long as China is very hyperactive, and then as long as a number of countries in the region don't agree with Chinese dominance in the region, we will see such different mechanism, creative maybe, mechanism and initiatives to respond to that.
Thanks, Evan. Alessio?
So the answer to the question has to be divided into two parts. One is very much about what do we think, or to what extent we think that the current elites in Beijing, revolving around Xi Jinping, think about the world in binary terms. Because if we agree that they see the rest of the world in oppositional terms, then no matter what you do, it's still going to just reinforce this worldview, this perspective that already exists. So part of the answer is not out of our control. The other part is, do mechanisms, particularly minilaterals like the Quad and AUKUS, actually help us moving towards a more stable environment and, in a way, build a different type of future? Absolutely, yes. In fact, I am happy to die on that fence in arguing that minilaterals like the Quad and AUKUS, and if I understood Wong Li Tu correctly, that's also what she was pointing towards, are going to be the main modus operandi in international affairs, and particularly sort of in the broader Indo-Pacific. Why? Because if you look at both the Quad and the AUKUS, they have two components. One is they are a response to a practical problem in which like-minded partners get together and try to sort it out. That's one element, right? So in the case of AUKUS, you've got the Australian mandate on national security changing, nuclear submarines, nuclear-powered submarines no longer becoming a taboo and a problem, as it was the case 5 years ago, and then there's a solution that comes together. So that's like, if you want, it's the changing dynamics, the signaling that Wong Li Tu was talking about. But I think that both the Quad and in a different way AUKUS speak to another components to this, and that is the down payment towards addressing the potential power imbalance that is being created today in the region, and that is building resilience among like-minded partners. Because AUKUS is not just about submarines. In fact, it is a science and tech defense cooperation, with the submarine deal being the first project in it. The same way Quad, as we've seen with the first summit in person, is changing into a sort of a hybrid space where you've got vaccine diplomacy, where you've got resilience of supply chains. These are the sort of places where you start with three, four, five members. You start looking at the problem. The key thing in the success of these minilaterals is, one, not to be exclusive. This is not about clubbing. It's about, or it is, but clubbing in an inclusive sense. And number two, for them to continue to remain focused on that practical balance between short-term requirements and long-term advantages. So long as this happens, I think these minilaterals are what we're going to be the way forward in the foreseeable future. Over.
Thanks, Alessio. All right, let's stick with the Quad AUKUS discussion for a little while, and I'll try to get through some of the questions topically. So, Pujo, we have a question from Kwakan Tran, which I'm sure you've heard before. Some analysts view India as the loosest link in the Quad, although I point out that most Indian analysts tell me that Australia is the loosest link in the Quad, so we can have a debate there. With that in mind, though, how do you think India is going to increase its commitment to the region down the line?
All right, thank you for the question. And yes, India has been quoted, like I've read several analysts calling India as a weak point. However, I would see it as a capability issue that India recognizes within itself, that where it can just commit itself to a point and not beyond that at this point of time, in terms of in getting into the institutions like Quad. As the hindrance that why India is being called. However, on the other side, India has been a regular feature in all of the Quad, summits, and it has made several strong commitments in terms of Quad. Maybe not so much in the traditional areas of security, where having a common adversary would be concerned. However, as the Quad is shifting its focus to a newer avenues of cooperation, where security issues in terms of HADR, green energy, and other technology linkages is concerned, I think India is making its commitments, and I think it will stand up to it. So I think it is just the capability linked issue which we are facing right now, and yeah, that is the problem, that why India has been called elusive actor at the moment, which is completely understandable.
Let me stick with the same question there. So Kwakan Tran also asked a follow-up: will enhancing oil and gas cooperation with Vietnam be a viable option here? And we had a couple other questions, since you raised the point about ONGC's investments in Vietnam's offshore energy industry.
Sorry, could you come again? Sorry,
will India's role in oil and gas cooperation in the South China Sea be a major part of its, I guess, push in the Indo-Pacific?
As far as the recent reports are concerned, till now we have not been able to find substantial amount of oil that can be commercially exploited in the South China Sea. However, I think the two countries, I think, will keep on looking for newer blocks and where they might seek oil and gas for it. So I think it's just a matter of time when we find a oil rig where we can commercially work with Vietnam and maybe other countries to extract that kind of oil. So energy security, of course, in terms of oil exploration remains a crucial issue. However, bigger issue I would see would be the uninterrupted trade routes that we are seeking through Straits of Malacca, Lombok and Sunda Straits, where India sees its energy supply as a crucial component to its peace and stability and growth.
Thanks. Hung, I would like to go to this question from Vu Haidong about Vietnam's response to AUKUS. So Vu Haidong is at National University of Singapore. He said, how do you read, or how does Australia read Vietnam's reaction to the AUKUS deal, which has been very neutral, almost painfully neutral when you read the statements?
Yes, I think Vietnam was quite careful, and I think it took a little bit time before it issued a very enigmatic and short message. But I think if you compare to the other regional responses, I think Australia is relatively pleased with it because it's not alarmist, it's not overly welcoming, but it's certainly not rejecting. I think the key word there in the statement is, because Vietnam said that every country in the region has responsibility to uphold or contribute to the stability and security in the region. I think something along this line. And the key words there is responsibility, right? So first of all, yes, submarines or whatever capability. Okay, I mean, every country has the rights to take care of their own defense, but it must be responsible, meaning that it does not contribute to arms race or provoke the nuclear non-proliferation debate too much. But responsibility also is referring to shouldering and being responsible for own defense, as well as contributing to the regional defense capabilities, because a lot of countries in the region don't have similar capacities. And this is something that, for example, the Philippines' response was quite, from the foreign secretary, was more explicit about that. But I think Vietnam has more neutral way of expressing that. It's probably closer along the line of Singaporeans' response, but certainly it's not as alarmist as some voices from Malaysia or even Indonesia is. So I think that's a neutral coded way of okay, let's see what's next, because actually we don't know details, right? The deals are still going to be negotiated in the next at least 18 months. We don't know exactly when those submarines will arrive, whether it's the 2030s or 2040s. So there's a lot of things can still change. We have elections in Australia, several elections before that, actually before the submarines arrive, but certainly election before the deal is finalized. So there are a lot of details unknown there. So I think that's also why Vietnam didn't want to say anything too specific or too binding in that regard. But I guess that it's interested in learning more, and it's interested to see that countries in the region are taking up and being more creative in responding to the recent growing tensions in the region.
Thanks, Hung. Tetzel, we've got a similar question for you from Renato De Castro at De La Salle University. He asked a three-parter. Was Tokyo informed of AUKUS before it was announced? How does Tokyo view AUKUS? And would Tokyo want to join AUKUS in the future?
Well, thank you. I need to be cautious responding to this sensitive question. As far as I know, the Japanese government wasn't officially informed in advance. So basically, we didn't know until the very last moment. And when we heard about AUKUS, in fact, there was a big response inside the Japanese strategic community. First of all, because we were defeated 6 years ago over the Australian next generation submarine with French. So now that the French is defeated, so we felt like defeated twice by Australians. So we had a kind of mixed feeling toward the announcement of AUKUS. But strategic perspective, from strategic perspective, we do understand its importance. Basically, our submarines cover the East China Sea, and US covers the South China Sea. But over the next 2 decades, the number of US submarines will reduce. So if Australians can cover the South China Sea by its nuclear-powered submarines, that could make perfect sense from strategic perspective. So we very much welcome the AUKUS, although we do think the Biden administration should have dealt with French in a different way. And lastly, whether or not Japan is interested in joining AUKUS, at least on the submarine deal, we have no role to play because we don't have nuclear submarines. For other technology cooperation, there might be a possibility. I'm personally recommending the Japanese and American government officials that we should consider to co-develop a new interceptors to deal with North Korean and Chinese new ballistic and cruise missiles and hypersonic vehicles. So missile development, interceptor development might open up a way for Japan to join AUKUS, but it's just my personal opinion.
Thanks, Tetsuo. All right, let's open it up a bit. We've got a lot of questions just about the South China Sea in general, and so maybe I'll unfairly start with Alessio on this one because it's not directed at anybody on the panel. From John James, this is a question that we get pretty much every year for 11 years now. Would you consider the actions of the U.S. and its surrogates, which, by the way, I think using the term surrogates shows your hand a little bit, with regard to the South China Sea, principally about forestalling the natural dominance of China in its home region? Can you contrast China's maritime philosophy there with the U.S. Monroe Doctrine?
Right. Okay. I mean, it's an excellent question, and it's a question worth addressing because we always, it's absolutely right to try to think outside the box, right? You think you're on the right side of history, as it were, but that might not be the case. And standing on the back of 2021 and where we are today, certainly I would say this is certainly not the view that is shared from within the region. And so, speaking as one of the surrogates of the United States, you know, I think the UK was part of that lot. I'll hazard an opinion about this, but that's the feeling I have. My impression is that from where the UK stands, certainly the integrated review inclusion of an Indo-Pacific field as part of our re-engagement and recasting of the engagement with the Indo-Pacific under a broader umbrella has been very much positively received across the region. You know, from within the region, within whether it is Southeast Asia, whether it is Japan, India, the impression, generally speaking, has been we want to see more of the UK. So if the United States and its surrogates were to behave in a way that were to bring about instability and source of tensions and whatnot, then surely you would not see such a positive reaction to a stronger commitment. So in that sense, my sort of on the back of this, therefore, I would suggest that this is a very good question. But if the question, it's the type of question that if you get an answer that you don't like, then you should also start thinking, okay, maybe this question is based on assumptions that are not shared. Why is that the case? That's exactly the type of critical thinking process that goes on in London every single time we decide to take an action anywhere in the Indo-Pacific or elsewhere for that matters. And so it's sort of thinking that I would imagine that should go around in other capitals as well. And I'll stop here.
Thanks. Let's see. Hong, I'll be just as unfair and ask you to answer this one, because again, we have a lot of questions not directed to any individual member. Sherlock Lee asked, why have ASEAN nations as a whole not acted as strongly on the South China Sea as outside parties like US, Japan, Australia?
Yes, this is a question probably people like Greg and I are asking every day. And I think the barrels of ink have been poured, as one of our friends and colleagues have described another thing. But I think it's a very different circumstances and strategic conditions that have situated them where they are now. Obviously, some of the ASEAN countries have claims, territorial claims, and some not. And throughout this conference, we've dived into individual nations' perspective and claims. But as a whole, as ASEAN as a whole, I think is really struggling to get to any point of consensus or solidarity on pretty much any matter these days, is especially when it's as important of strategic value. It's really hard to get this ASEAN countries to have one position these days, and South China Sea being the key example of that. But more recently, similarly with the case of Myanmar crisis, for example. And we just discussed how different Southeast Asian countries react to AUKUS. That's another example of just how diverse their individual national perspectives are. And I think it's a perennial question, a perennial issue. If we haven't breach those gaps in the last 50 over years of the ASEAN existence, and some of them have been in ASEAN shorter, the CLMV in particular. But if this process of ASEAN has not reached to breach that the gap, I think going forward is going to be even harder for ASEAN to have more unified and solid and solidarity in many of those issues. So I think there are few ways to come out of that. Either ASEAN has to think of other ways of decision making, not just consensus, or we just have to come to terms that ASEAN is simply won't be able to reach in many of issues any unified position. This is a long way to answer you the question, but I think it's a question that all Southeast Asian and ASEAN scholars have been asking, and I guess the answer is also in a very ASEAN way.
Fair enough. So in the spirit of fairness, I'll take a tough one myself. Conley, retired from MOD in Vietnam, asked me, do I know when the U.S. and the Philippines are going to review their mutual defense treaty, particularly U.S. commitments within the Philippine EEZ? And so Conley's referring to the repeated statements by Secretary of National Defense Delfin Lorenzana in the Philippines, and recently by others, including Ambassador Romualdez here in Washington, that the treaty needs to be updated and reviewed. And the answer to that is, I think the Secretary's been pretty clear that they're not actually talking about reopening the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty. I think everybody knows that if you reopen a treaty in 2021, you're never going to get it re-ratified, right? The U.S. alliance system is a historical artifact of the early Cold War. You will never get a new U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty ratified by the U.S. Congress. So what they're talking about, what Secretary Lorenzana is talking about, and he was quite explicit when he spoke here at CSIS 2 months ago, was first contingency planning for the gray zone? How does the alliance apply in cases below armed conflict involving Chinese maritime militia and so on? Second, continual reiteration that it applies in the South China Sea, which has been going on for a couple administrations now. And third, what kind of support will there be for the U.S. from the U.S. for the Armed Forces Modernization Program in the Philippines? And so I think we're going to see that become a process. Secretaries Lorenzon and Austin talked about this when they were when they met at the Pentagon during Secretary Lorenzon's visit. They've established a new maritime dialogue. There's likely to be new defense guidelines for the alliance, similar to those that the U.S. regularly, well, not regularly, but every few years negotiates with both Japan and Australia. And so TBD, I said, keep an eye on it, but I don't think we should actually think that there's going to be any negotiation of the text of the MDT, because that would amount to basically killing the MDT. And with that, let me step back out of the spotlight and give one to Pooja. So we have a question from Siddharth Iyer from DOD, who asked, what are the prospects of India expanding military activities in the South China Sea? For instance, freedom navigation operations, joint patrols, that kind of thing.
That's a good question. Actually, with my conversation with the Indian naval officers, India has been present in the Indian Navy has been present in the South China Sea waters. Freedom of navigation is a different ballgame, and I have not seen that much of confidence, at least as per my experience from the officers, that they might conduct overt freedom of navigation exercises. However, they keep on stating that whatever action, the activities in the high seas they do is actually a part of the freedom of navigation. In the waters of South China Sea that they do is a part of reiterating their support to freedom of navigation. I think that is something that remains not very clear in terms of overt expression that how India wants to go about freedom of navigation. However, as the talks in my experience tell me that they have been conducting regular visits and exercises with other countries, and I think that is somewhat tantamount to that, given the current Indian capabilities allow it. Tomorrow, if you have better capabilities, more muscle, I think we can go for more overt exercises.
Thanks, Pooja. Tetsuo, Renato has a second question for you. And while I normally wouldn't ask two questions from the same questioner, it's a good one. So I'm going to give Renato a pass. He said Japan has provided several Southeast Asian countries with maritime assets. You talked about the recent radars to the Philippines, but Tokyo has not provided any Southeast Asian country with lethal military assets, surface combatants, fighter planes, etc. Do you see Japan providing or selling Southeast Asian countries military materiel in the future?
Well, technically speaking, Japan is now able to provide those lethal equipments to the Southeast Asian partners because we changed our law. But the question is whether or not the recipient countries will be willing to accept those sensitive equipments. I'm kind of doubt any ASEAN member countries are positive to accept lethal weapons from Japan or the US or other extra regional powers, because that would provoke China. So I think the best way is to start, the best way for us to sell non-sensitive equipment such as the patrol boats or radar or training aircraft. And then gradually we can expand the targets of our capacity building when time is right. So technically we can do it, but it's a political decision by the recipient country, basically.
Thanks, Tetsuo. All right, let me stay with you for the next question too, and maybe others on the panel have thoughts on this. Casey Lee said, we haven't talked much about ASEAN centrality. I think several of you said it, kind of every statement from the Quad and AUKUS now says ASEAN centrality. But when we really get down to it, do AUKUS and the Quad weaken ASEAN centrality? If not, how are they working with or around ASEAN to strengthen regional security?
Well, at least Quad, I think the original aim of the Quad was more a military centric framework. But it turned out we are putting Quad, changing Quad as a kind of a framework to provide public goods to the region, the vaccines, climate change assistance, or supply chain resilience. And part of the reason of this change is, of course, some Quad members are more reluctant to pursue military-centric cooperation. But at the same time, the another reason is because of the concerns among the ASEAN member countries. So we are kind of adjusting the nature of Quad so that the regional countries, particularly the ASEAN member countries, can accept. So in that sense, I think at least the Quad is not negative on ASEAN centrality, and I think the Quad member countries are willing to work with ASEAN-related frameworks, including the EAS. AUKUS is a little bit different. It's a cooperation among the long-term allies to pursue a problem solving. In this case, the balance of underwater capabilities. It's basically irrelevant to the ASEAN centrality. But at least the Quad is the presumption of Quad is maintaining the ASEAN centrality, I think.
Do you have, well, actually, let me ask you a follow-up to pick up one of the other questions. So Sharon Sitai from Brunei just put in a question. So speaking of ASEAN centrality, would there be any other initiatives that the Quad or AUKUS parties could do to promote ASEAN centrality?
Thanks, Greg. I've written extensively on that, so I hope you will indulge me if I get too carried away by these questions. I think there are a few ways to look at it. First of all, I think ASEAN centrality has been challenged in many ways, whether by Quad or AUKUS or anything externally. I think we've discussed earlier the issues of disagreement in South China Sea, code of conduct, Myanmar, and you name it. So, there will be challenges to ASEAN centrality, whether with Quad or AUKUS or not. That's number one. I think my studies regarding the relationship between Quad and ASEAN actually found out that despite what kind of popular narrative had been in the past, that the Quad could overshadow or take away centrality from ASEAN, my survey findings actually found the opposite. Many of the ASEAN member states and elites and thinkers think that Quad would complement ASEAN because it can deliver where ASEAN cannot, or it's willing to work on the issues, including the security issues or rules-based order and things that ASEAN still can't make up its mind on. So that's number two. But of course, the conversation has shifted a little bit, right? The Quad has evolved, and the question is whether ASEAN's opinion on Quad evolved with the Quad or not. I think there will be residual hesitancy and doubts among some groups, and that's hard to change. It's hard to change people's mind. But I think both Quad and AUKUS represent a new form of mini-lateralism that does not involve any of ASEAN member states. So in the past, we've had ASEAN central architecture, right? Multilateral. We also have mini-laterals that both involve or not involve ASEAN. But for some reasons, a Quad and AUKUS that don't involve any ASEAN member states, are being questioned about that. But I think that's exactly the response, because some people would argue that because ASEAN is so not effective in many of the security issues, therefore the needs for mechanisms like Quad and AUKUS. So whether ASEAN likes it or not, I think mechanisms like that or initiatives like that will continue to appear, because they're smaller. It's not big as big multilateral. They're issue based. They're easier to reach. Agreed position. It's usually like-minded partner in the targeted issue. So I think that's really the current trend, and whether ASEAN likes it or not will happen. The question is whether ASEAN can claim back the centrality itself, not by preventing other initiatives to come up. But ASEAN needs to really exercise and showcase its centrality.
Thanks. Pooja, we have another question from Commodore Zak, and since I already asked about Vietnam's and Japan's view on AUKUS, I'll ask you. Commodore Zak said, how does India view AUKUS as either complementing or contradicting the Quad? And I guess in general, how does India feel about AUKUS?
Yes, AUKUS has been it has been debate in Indian policymakers and strategists. And I think a general trend that I have observed around AUKUS is they understand that AUKUS is a military arrangement between the countries which have capabilities. So they have capabilities of certain kinds, and they can cooperate. And they already had certain cooperation, going in terms of Five Eyes and others. So I think that just complements that part. However, I personally also do not see AUKUS as a threat to Quad. I think it's actually complementing the deed of Quad. Quad could not come up to the military, capability that it was expected from past few years. However, what AUKUS has done is to fill in that gap that was there, of providing submarines to a country and for a larger maritime domain awareness, or for maritime presence. So I think if something these countries could not do at this moment of time, I think AUKUS will be able to do. However, given the fact on the ground is AUKUS, the first ship under AUKUS and the submarine under AUKUS would not be there until 2040. So it is a good amount of time before we just see that action happening in actual. And I think that is where I think Quad should think about what they would want to do if AUKUS wants to take that kind of responsibility of that being militarily present. In the meanwhile of next 20 years, what Quad can do, to be able to match up in some ways in that regard of security arrangement. Thank you.
Thanks, Pooja. Okay, we have just a few minutes left, and since this is the last panel of the conference, I want to do our best to get through them, so I'm going to go into a lightning round. What I'm going to ask, I've got a bunch of questions. They're pretty much yes or no's. I'm just going to call one of you, and I ask you to give me a yes or no, or a highly likely or not likely, all right? Let's start with Alessio. Alessio, Stephen Parton said, do you think PRC naval vessels stepping up aggressive shadowing and close maneuvers increases the risk of a military crisis in the near term?
No.
All right.
Tensions will happen, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a crisis happening. Go on, next one.
Excellent. Hung, will we get a code of conduct?
No. Maybe in 50 years.
Then I didn't need to ask the follow-up about it being legally binding. Pooja, can the South China Sea issue be resolved in the UN Security Council?
Very difficult. With the current members, very difficult.
Excellent. All right. I think that's all of our yes or no's. So let me close it with this. I didn't have one for you, Tetsuo. I'm sorry. Chandler Rochelle from Georgetown University asked, what should we have done differently to prevent consolidation of China's position in the South China Sea? Did we rely too much on the 2016 arbitration award? Maybe we can just go down the line. What should we have done differently over the last 5 years? Tetsu, why don't I start with you? What should we have done differently since the last time you appeared on this conference?
Well, it's a tough question for the last. Well, I think we should have engaged with other regional partners who are cautious on emphasizing the importance of peaceful dispute resolution. Perhaps we should have approached some ASEAN member countries, some South Asian countries, and even the European countries on this, so that they could show a collective voice on the importance of the peaceful dispute resolution.
Thanks. Pooja, any thoughts on what we should have done differently?
Yeah, I think we ignored the problem for the longest time till the problem was just attacked on our faces. So I think what we should have done in our last 5 years is to become more vocal. More and more countries have to come out with their official statements about South China Sea, and I think that should be a very much signaling to China about its action in South China Sea. I think that kind of unity has to come in the international multilateral cooperation has to come in the recent times and the times to come. That might change his position.
Hung?
I think agree with my colleagues, but I think I would bet on crystal ball. I would bet on stronger reaction or action that prevent China's militarization and building of the artificial islands. But that's probably longer than 5 years, earlier than 5 years.
Thanks. Alessio, you get the last word.
Yes. Start naming and shaming certain type of behavior much earlier. And above all, never allowed Xi Jinping in the Garden Rose to tell that he wasn't militarizing the South China Sea.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. That's it, folks. We made it. That's the end of hopefully our last solely virtual South China Sea conference. Fingers crossed. Thank you all very much. And again, you can catch anything that you missed online at csis.org or YouTube in the next 48 hours or so. Thank you. Stay safe. Have a good day or a good evening.